I'm Warren Hoge, IPI Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Distinguished Author Series event featuring Robert Kagan, historian, Washington Post contributing columnist, and author of The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World. This series of Distinguished Author Series events began 11 years and some 50 books ago. And for most of that time, the books I chose rather deliberately steered clear of American foreign policy. That was in keeping with the international character of this UN-centered community, and of IPI itself, where our staff of 45 come from more than 25 different countries, and our research focuses more on Africa, Asia, and South America. We've had books on Russia, China, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, Kenya, the Central African Republic, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Islamic fundamentalism, and the Arab Spring and its aftermath. But starting with Financial Times columnist Edward Luce's book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, a year and a half ago, and then Bill Drozdiak's book, Fractured Continent, Europe's Crises and the Fate of the West, I found myself increasingly turning to books about what is happening in Europe and America and its consequences for the world. Just last month, we had Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass speaking about his book, The World in Disarray, American Foreign Policy and the Crisis of the Old Order. And tonight, I am delighted to welcome here the noted historian Bob Kagan and his new book, as I told you, The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World. Bob's book has the sweep of the eminent historian that he is, but it pays particular attention to the last 70 to 75 years and the unraveling during that time of a US-led liberal world order that seemed to be so secure and so successful that in the widely cited 1989 essay, the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the victory of the Western liberal model of governance and famously said it constituted the end of history. In his book, Bob responds with the return of history, and it's hardly a warm and fuzzy welcome back. Instead, it's an urgent warning about how anti-liberal authoritarianism is gaining adherents in alarming numbers in Europe and the United States, the two places where democracy has most flourished. And it's also a reminder that this post-war period of relative peacefulness, and by that I mean no world wars, no massive epidemics, this period, the last 70, 75 years, has really been an aberration in his formulation, historically speaking. The historical norm instead, as Bob will argue, has been towards chaos, towards the unruly jungle of the book's title. The book is refreshingly concise. Do I have a copy up here? It's about that thick, as opposed to other books we have here. And I'm going to make sure we finish up here in plenty of time to give Bob a chance to sign copies and to chat with you. Now, this month, in a much commented upon Washington Post essay derived from the book, Bob has stirred up a lot of commotion because he wrote that authoritarianism is becoming an ideology as threatening to the West as communism was during the Cold War. Now, that's a striking comment from someone with the Cold War credentials of Robert Kagan. In sounding this alarm, Bob said his purpose was to, quote, spur a conversation about these dangers and alert people to the growing challenge to our liberty. No better place to do that, say I, than here at IPI, so please welcome Bob Kagan.
Well, thank you so much, Warren, and thank you all for being here, and thanks for inviting me to this lovely place. I was told two things by some lovely women here. One, that I was dressed okay, I didn't actually make it to my hotel in time to change, so this is what you get. But also that the view is so great that you won't be looking at me anyway, so, which is just fine. I'll just lay out a little bit the thesis of my book and maybe talk a little bit about the essay that Warren referred to in the Washington Post, which, by the way, I have to give the Washington Post enormous credit for publishing a 10,000-word essay, which is, as Warren knows well, is not what newspapers have normally done.
I was once the editor of the New York Times Magazine, and our top limit was 6,000.
Which is pretty good, actually, but you couldn't get 6,000 in today's magazine. So anyway, that's the only hope I have for tonight, by the way, is that you can still write a 10,000-word essay and somebody may even read it. So, but I'm going to, let me just do that. But I want to leave a lot of time for our discussion. I really appreciate that you all have come out here this evening. I'm sure you could be doing much more fun things than this. So I want to make sure we have a good opportunity to talk things through. The title of the book refers to a metaphor, basically, which has to do with the idea of a garden. I'm not a gardener, but I understand the principle of a garden, and I've watched people grow gardens. And the one thing you know about there are a few things you know about a garden. One is that it's an artificial creation. It's not something that appears naturally. It's something that humans make. And you also know that once you've created it, you don't walk away and come back a week or 2 weeks later and expect to still find a garden there. You know that there are natural forces, by the way, not even necessarily evil forces, at work constantly undermining the garden from within and coming over it from without, the weeds and the vines that nature creates basically to reclaim the land in this artificial creation. And that, to my mind, is the best way to think about the liberal world order that we talk about so frequently, that was created very much by the United States, but not only by the United States, but also by its democratic partners after World War II. Because that too, all orders are artificial creations, good orders and bad orders, because the natural tendency of the international system is toward chaos and conflict. That is where things normally head unless you impose some kind of order. But it also, I think it's important to realize, defied all kinds of natural forces in both international life and also in human nature. One of the things that I think we wanted to believe, we're all children of the Enlightenment, and one of the sort of core Enlightenment ideas is the idea of progress, that humankind has been moving through history and basically improving as the centuries have gone on. This was founded at about the same time as the birth of science, and the general assumption was that as humankind's knowledge expanded, their scientific knowledge, their technological knowledge, that their knowledge of how to treat one another would also expand, and that human beings would gradually learn how to behave better. And if you read a book, one of the best-selling books of the last couple of years is by Steven Pinker. I can't remember the title of it right now, but you know what I'm talking about. And his essential argument is that the Enlightenment, he traces in some detail the fact that violence against human-to-human violence, if you will, and not just in wars, but even in everyday life, has declined precipitously over the past few decades, and he attributes that to the sort of implanting and sort of victory of Enlightenment principles. You mentioned Frank Fukuyama's famous essay, which was about the triumph in a Hegelian sense after many centuries of competition, of competing ideas about how humans could best interact and create the best kind of society. Which also was an idea of progress. If you read what he says, he basically says there clearly is something in all societies that head toward liberalism. And I think at the base of that is some judgment about human nature that what humans ultimately want, and Frank talks about this in his essay, and Hegel talks about it, borrowing to some extent from Hegel, that all human beings seek recognition of their worth as individuals. And that the society that best delivers that recognition, which is a society that recognizes their individual rights and individual freedoms, is therefore the one most likely to succeed, and that's what we thought had happened. So we had this view, because it's in our nature as children of the Enlightenment to have this view that things were all heading in a certain direction. Unfortunately, I don't believe that that's true. I don't really. There is scientific progress, there is the expansion of knowledge, but I am unpersuaded and have been unpersuaded. Unfortunately now, given the way the world is going, I'm especially unpersuaded that human beings necessarily behave better over time the more they know. I think we should be able to see now what I think others had seen, people like whether it was Machiavelli or the ancient Greeks, that human nature is actually a lot of different competing impulses, that human beings want to have their individual worth respected, but they also want security, and the kind of security that comes from tribe and family and nation. There are times when human beings don't even want necessarily, don't even value freedom and individual rights. They sometimes want a strong leader to sort of both protect them and to lead the way. We generally have operated on the assumption that wherever there is a dictatorship, what you have is one person or group of persons suppressing an otherwise popular demand for freedom and democracy. I think we should have now learned that things are more complicated than that. That sometimes strong leaders are able to maintain their strongman rule because it is accepted, possibly even welcomed by at least a large number of people. And so what I would say is that what we have been living in over the past 70 to 75 years is an artificial creation, and it was inevitable, as it has always been inevitable, that elements of human nature and forces in the international system were always going to seek in their own way to pull this system down. And to me, the question was never, what is it that's destroying our liberal world order? The question is, what can possibly hold it up? Because it is such, as you mentioned before, such a deviation from history. And the minute you disenthrall yourself, and I'm not asking you to do that, I have had no choice but to do that, the minute you disenthrall yourself from the idea of progress, then it becomes very clear that in the grand sweep of human history, this period we've been living through is an incredibly unique period. And I'll just, in three ways that I think we can all see. One, Warren already mentioned the lack of great power conflict. And, we are obviously unhappy about the wars that we have participated in, which haven't gone well or were mistakes or whatever. But they're not mistakes like World War II and World War I. And even some of the wars like the Franco-Prussian War, which led to, millions actually dead and wounded. The world has been spared this kind of cataclysmic great power conflict that really was the norm throughout human history. Great powers have basically been at war, whether they're empires or city-states or nation-states. They've been at war and in struggle with each other almost constantly throughout history. And this period, they have not been. And then, of course, as we all know, there's been this incredible explosion of prosperity during this period. Throughout most of human history, if you wanted, those economic historians have gone back to try to measure, let's say, average global GDP growth. You won't be surprised to know that average global GDP growth for almost the entirety of human history is zero. Most people have lived in a state of abject poverty, except for the tiniest fraction. I'm not even talking about the 1%, I'm talking about the 0.00001%. And the prosperity that we have known during this period, which has really been on an average of annual global GDP growth of roughly 4% a year since the end of World War II, is just unlike any other period in history, and the consequences of it are apparent all around us, because it hasn't just been in the transatlantic space, where most 19th century growth took place because of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, but this growth has been global, and the consequence is that between 4 and 5 billion people have lifted themselves out of poverty into the largest middle class that the world has ever known. And I think connected to the other two things, obviously the other remarkable fact of this period has been the explosion of democratic government. Democracy is the rarest form of government in history. It's so rare prior to the 19th century that you could almost look at it as an accident. It was an accidental democracy in Athens, an accidental democracy in Venice, and you could name a couple of other places. But of course, we've seen an explosion of democracy like at no other time. So why we would think, I suppose I understand why we would think that all these incredible things are just the natural evolution of humankind, that we've reached some new plateau of existence. But I think history tells us that no, we have been living in a prosperous, democratic, and roughly peaceful time because of the international structures that that the founders of this order deliberately created to prevent backsliding into what they had experienced in their lifetimes, which was World War, depression, nationalism, and all the ills that we saw in the first half of the 20th century. And so what we are seeing today, I would say, is on the one hand, the weeds and the vines growing back as they do. And the problem is not that they are growing back because that was inevitable. The problem is that we are not resisting them in the way that we did before, that we are not gardening in the way that we had for 75 years. And by the way, I'm not here to tell you that our 75 years of foreign policy during the Cold War and after the Cold War was a brilliant, without mistakes, without hysteria, without exaggeration, etc. American foreign policy, as someone who studies it, is not something that you would say, wow, what a brilliant country. But we have gotten some things fundamentally right in this period. And what we have fundamentally done throughout these 75 years is constantly push back against the jungle. And I think, again, the more we don't push back, the more we see the jungle creeping back. We see it in Europe. We see it around the world. We see it in great power conflict. We see it in the rise of nationalism and tribalism. And of course, we see it even in the United States. We sometimes have a very rosy view of our own history, but it's worth remembering that in the United States, there has been an ongoing battle, I would say, against these same forces of the jungle. We have fought through slavery. We have fought through racial prejudice, which still exists today. We have competing views of what our nationalism really means, whether it's the universal principles of the Declaration or the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nationalism that others have seen in this country, have seen as the true nation. We're having that battle. We had that battle in the 1920s. We had that battle in the 1950s and 60s, and we're having it again. All of which is to say, and this is not the cheeriest talk one could possibly give, but all of this is to say, I don't accept fatalism of either kind. I don't think that we had reached the plateau and there could be no backsliding after 1989, and I don't believe, as many people write these days, that democracy and liberalism are finished. It has always been a struggle. It's been a struggle in this country, and it's been a struggle in the world. And the one message I would leave anybody with is that at this time, more than at any other time that I can think of, every single individual in this country needs to be an activist. We spend too much time, I think, talking about how our institutions are going to protect us, how the checks and balances of the system are going to protect us. If only we can elect a different person in 2020, that person will take care of it. None of these things are true. The institutions will not protect us unless we make them protect us. The institutions don't work without people. People don't get elected unless people elect them, and a president can't do it by him or herself in any case. And so this is a time for us to remember that these have always been a fight, and it's time for us to be fighting again. Thank you.
I'm going to have a chat with Bob for a little bit, and then we'll get you involved and ask some questions. Bob, one of the things in reading the book that I was reminded of, and it's interesting thinking about America today, is that in the first half of the 20th century, Americans felt quite secure in the fact that there was an ocean on either side, and felt that the problems of the outside was, as a matter of fact, in my childhood, I think I sort of thought about problems in far as not ones that would ever come to America. But that sense which we associate with the first half of the 20th century and before has really come back now in a rather remarkable way at a time when, because of communication and transportation, there really is no safety in having an ocean on either side. Does that prompt you to talk a bit more about it? Because I'm fascinated that has happened culturally.
Right. I mean, in looking at Americans' attitude toward the world, and you're certainly right that we have shifted back to what I think, I hate to say, is the more normal American approach to the world. And again, this is the question that we always have to keep in mind. What is the norm? What is the normal behavior, and what is the abnormal behavior? I would argue that Americans after World War II have behaved abnormally. Most nations, and I would really almost say all nations in history, have a very narrow understanding of what their national interest is. You protect your borders, you try to protect your prosperity, you do not decide that problems and crises that are 3,000 miles away in one direction and 7,000 miles in another direction are your direct responsibility and, in fact, your primary responsibility. That is a very unusual way of looking at the world. It was brought on by the experience of 2 world wars and then the onset of the Cold War. I think there is nothing less surprising that after the end of the Cold War, Americans would say, as, by the way, Jean Kirkpatrick did say in an essay she wrote, not her Dictatorships and Double Standards, but back in 1990, that it was time for America to become a normal nation again.
Jean Kirkpatrick was Ronald Reagan's ambassador right here at the UN.
Absolutely, great. And and I think most Americans also have been saying, why do we have to shoulder this enormous global responsibility? And, you know, even though what you say is true about the oceans not meaning as much as they obviously once did with the communications technology and intercontinental missiles, etc., it is entirely understandable and not entirely wrong for Americans to think, whether they consciously say this to themselves or not, that whatever is happening around the world, we're going to be the last ones affected by it. When the world falls apart, Asians will feel it immediately, Europeans will feel it immediately, Africans, subcontinent, we will not feel it immediately. And it's a very hard case to make that ultimately it does come back to us. You know, when I think about what was going on in the 1930s, now granted, we hadn't had the experience of global leadership really, but nevertheless, at a time when Nazi Germany had conquered Poland, and even after the fall of France, we had the most gifted politician in the history of the United States, which was Franklin Roosevelt, unable to persuade Americans that this was something that now required us to get involved with. Now, when I think of that, I think, boy, I don't know what it would take now to change Americans' perception of how much they have to worry about what's going on around the world. Now, there's also this very great tendency that we all have, which I think Americans have very much succumbed to assume that things can never get that bad. And part of my, you know, hysterical diatribe has been to say things can get so much worse than you think, so much faster. But people don't believe it. You know, they think people tend to do a straight line, you know, calculation. Things will be roughly the way they are now. Europe will look roughly the way it does. Asia will look roughly the way it does. Even if China gains hegemony in Asia, it'll be kind of a smooth transition, you know, which it definitely will not be. But so between the comforting sort of sense that whatever we have now is sort of lasting, between the belief in the 2 oceans, but also very importantly, between the desire of Americans to say, can't we just be like any other normal nation? I think these are very powerful psychological forces that are hard to overcome.
Let me talk to you about Europe because, in many ways, as worrisome, I think, as what's going on here, and particularly the fact that it seems to be so cultural. I have Europeans in my family, and some of them talk vaguely about the feeling they have that they don't use the word polluted, but they're being attacked from the outside, that their Christian culture, which they think of as their national culture, is challenged by this. I lived in Europe for 8 years. I remember even then, and that's now 15 years ago, I was aware of the fact that Muslim migration was going to be a tremendous problem for Europe, that they were going to have to absorb people in one generation that we did over about 4 or 5 generations. And the people we absorbed, frankly, were mostly Christians, and they were from the Western world, from Latin America, and places like that. But it's so much worse now than I thought it would be. And as in the audience is a brother-in-law of mine who is Dutch, and we went to the theater last week, and he said, in the minute, he said, "You don't know what's happening in my country, the Netherlands, the rise of a right-wing party there, of xenophobia, not xenophobia so much, but as again, fear of the outsider and pulling in." I would have said that's different than here, though, and I sometimes hear Trump talk about what he thinks American culture is. It sounds a bit like that also. But if I can just get you back talking about Europe again on those terms, I guess on all these questions, I'm wondering, how can we pull back? How do we get back that kind of attitude about how we take care of the people living on the other side of us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're obviously absolutely right. And again, this is one of those things that I think, to some extent, there's an inevitable backlash against liberalism, and Europe, in a way, was the most committed to the Enlightenment idea. That's what the European Union was about. It was about doing away with nationalism and tribalism. It was the ultimate Enlightenment, Kant stream. It was the ultimate Enlightenment accomplishment. But again, if you look throughout history, liberalism has always created, in a way, its own antibodies. Because, again, liberalism does not answer all human needs. And it doesn't particularly answer this desire for security, and by security I mean what you're talking about, not just physical security, but the perception of security in one's own culture, in one's own tribe and nation. And so, yes, it was the great immigration from the Middle East, and then particularly the refugee crisis in Syria, which we can get back to the American role in that too. But that refugee crisis created all these kinds of fears, and I think spurred something that probably was going to happen anyway. If you read, there's some very interesting work done by Ivan Krastev. I don't know whether he writes in the Times a lot, but he's talked about how in Eastern and Central Europe there is a kind of rebellion against what they regard as the imposition of this liberal, cosmopolitan Enlightenment approach, which cuts against, and it does. Liberalism does cut against traditional society. I think that they are compatible, but there's no question it cuts against the traditional authority of the church, including all the moral values that the church stands for. So a lot of Eastern Europeans are not just, and Russians and others are not just upset about immigration, they're also upset about women's rights and LGBTQ rights and all the other changes that they feel have been imposed on them, changes in their traditions that have been imposed on them. And that's what you see echoes as well of here in the United States. So I think that is something that was inevitable. The question really for me is, we're going to go through these phases we have in our own history. The 1920s were another period where Americans were sort of, a lot of old, traditional American values were under assault in various different ways, and there was a real pushback. The question is the system strong enough to withstand this period, or is it not? And what I find most upsetting is that we are in one of these, perfect storm moments. Europe, I think, is going through an inevitable crisis of liberalism. Maybe America's going through an inevitable crisis of liberalism. It's unfortunate that they're occurring at exactly the same time. It's unfortunate also that America, which has played such a critical role in keeping a certain stability in Europe, is now not only providing stability in Europe, but is actually exacerbating these crises. I mean, the fact that Trump makes it very clear, and his officials make it very clear, that they're actually on the side of European nationalists. They don't even support the center-right parties, which is who Ronald Reagan supported and Bush supported. This isn't Margaret Thatcher we're talking about. This is Nigel Farage we're talking about. This is Marine Le Pen we're talking about. This is Viktor Orban. These are the people that Trump wants to see succeed in these countries. And I could add other things that the United States is doing, which is taking Europe's existing problem and making them infinitely worse. And in the final part of our perfect storm, the fact that Great Britain has basically departed the scene as a power of any kind. It's sort of floating off into the Arctic Ocean. Britain played a really critical role in Europe throughout all this period. And so we pretty much have everything going wrong at the same time, which unfortunately reminds me of the 1930s, when everything went wrong at the same time. The only thing we're missing right now is another deep recession in the United States and Europe, which for all we know could be around the corner. So yeah, I have to get away from this now because now I'm depressing everybody.
Well, let me just ask you one last thing, and this is about the essay. Authoritarianism, you argue, is an ideology. Is it?
Well, it's an ideology in the following sense. First of all, I try in the essay, and that's why I took 10,000 words, to go back in history and say, let's remember how this whole conflict started. This conflict started with the birth of the first sort of liberal government founded on Enlightenment principles, which is the United States. And from the moment of that birth, the United States and liberalism generally found itself in conflict with what had been traditional hierarchies of all kinds. Monarchies, absolute monarchies, divine right monarchies, the hierarchy of the church, the hierarchy of class structure, etc. And the United States was this revolutionary power premised on a revolutionary doctrine, which was all about the protection of individual rights and saying explicitly that governments that did not protect individual rights could and should be overthrown. This was not welcomed throughout the world because every single government in the world, with the possible exception of Britain, was inherently threatened by this. And so, if you look at what the great powers of Europe were doing in the 19th century, Tsar Alexander's Russia, Metternich's Austria, the Frederick's Prussia, they were engaged in an effort to stamp out liberalism. And we kind of look back at them and think, well, they didn't really stand for anything, but they stood for everything. They stood for divine right monarchy. They stood for class hierarchy. They stood for the authority of the church, etc. All these things that traditional society was. And so ever since liberalism popped up, there has been an alternative, which is anti-liberalism. Now, we lost sight of this because during the Cold War, it was all about communism versus liberal capitalism, and the authoritarians were on their backs. They just happened, unfortunately for them, to lose the wars. So authoritarian governments were either dependent on the United States or they were chessboards in the Cold War. They were in no position to make their case. What we've seen over the past 15 years is the authoritarian governments first surviving, then getting the wind in their sails, and now they are engaged in a full-throated and traditional critique of liberalism. If you look at what Vladimir Putin has to say, it is the traditional critique of liberalism, up and down the line. And even the Chinese, they don't make a communist case against democracy, they make the traditional anti-liberal case about everything that's wrong with liberalism. And unfortunately, or inevitably, this anti-liberal critique even resonates within the liberal world itself. So I think we make a mistake in looking at these authoritarians as if they were devoid of an argument. They have an argument, and right now, their argument is doing pretty well. It's hard for us to remember, obviously, we weren't alive, but it's hard for us to remember that there was a time when people thought fascist governments were better than democratic governments. You know, Anne Morrow Lindbergh said that fascism is the wave of the future. And some people in America thought that. A lot of people in Europe thought that, especially during the Great Depression. So this idea that it's only communism, and this is, I think, you know, unfortunately, this was ultimately Frank Fukuyama's mistake, was in thinking that just because we had defeated communism as an ideology, therefore liberalism was triumphant, but there was this other and really older, and in my view, more powerful critique of liberalism waiting in the wings, and that's what we're confronted with today.
Excellent. I'm going to go get some questions from the audience, Bob. Terrific. Let me start here, Jonathan, there in the middle, and on this. We'll do one, two, I'll take three at once, okay?
As long as you help me remember what they are.
Okay, you can take notes.
Brain
there.
is not functioning as it wants.
Jonathan Granoff, thank you so much for raising our consciousness to what we're challenged by. You didn't point out some of the existential consequences of this, which is a failure of pursuit of cooperative security to address the destruction of the phytoplankton, the health of the oceans, the climate, which are looming before us, which will require a new international order to address this existential threat. And of course, the other one, which is undermining international treaty regimes, particularly ones relating to nuclear weapons, which are challenged. The NPT is coming up for review next year. But I question whether the analogy is the spreading jungle or more like a virus, because I look at some of the leaders of our country now and their assault on these principles, particularly John Bolton. And what I can't figure out, I understand the aspiration of empire of the Chinese, the Russians, the Ottomans, the Persians, and the Saudis, all authoritarian pursuits of empire. And I understand the liberal multinational empire that we've created based on values, the value that all people are equal. What I can't understand is the American leadership. What does success look like to them? What is their ought? What does John Bolton want to achieve? What does success look like in the American version of the authoritarian system?
I'm going to get back to you, but start here with Rima on the left, and then we'll make you number three.
I think.
Introduce yourself, because
Yes.
we're webcasting this, so they know.
Okay. Roma Stibravi, NGO Sustainability. I don't know if you agree, but what would the world look like if we didn't have the migration issue? And referring to what this gentleman said, at the same time, as critical, if not more critical, is what is happening to our planet.
And then in the middle there.
Thank you very much. Wasim Mir from the UN Foundation. Great book. Bob, I'd recommend the audiobook as well, which was a great listen.
I didn't read it.
Did you listen to it? It's worth listening to. So the last 70 years was probably an aberration in terms of the growth of liberalism, but it was probably also an aberration in terms of the relative strength of the United States economically and politically. And that was also bound to probably at some stage come to an end as other parts of the world, Asia in particular, rise. So I just wondered your thoughts on how those two things play into each other.
We'll take those three questions.
Yeah, great. Terrific questions. And let me start with climate, since two of you brought up climate. And I do think climate is, I think two things. One is that the climate problem is one that is a disaster in and of itself, but it is also going to exacerbate tremendously the geopolitical crises that we're having. And in particular, we can probably list many ways in which that's true, but in terms of fostering a greater migration crisis, it seems to be inevitable. As arable land disappears, as water resources disappear, there's going to be an inevitable migration, which is going to put even more strain on whatever liberal democratic institutions still exist at that point. And I mean, you know, if you can imagine, as the Europeans do fear another, God knows how many tens of millions of migrants coming out of Africa and heading toward Europe, you can only imagine what the effect on geopolitics, on politics, on democratic institutions would be. So that's the fifth part of the perfect storm that we are creating. And, of course, the return of geopolitical competition makes it even less likely that the world will come together to address that problem, because climate is a geopolitical issue as well. We are asking, as the Chinese repeatedly point out to us, we are asking to curb their power after we already polluted the world creating our power. Their view of that is not a positive one. The Indians feel the same way, not to mention our own unwillingness to take all kinds of steps. But I think that, you know, it's a perfect vicious circle, that the increasing geopolitical conflict is going to make it harder to address climate, and the effects of climate are going to make the geopolitical crisis worse. So we need some kind of radical surgery in that regard, which I don't foresee. You know, it's a very interesting question what success looks like too. And I would say, I have to, you know, here you have to say John Bolton and Donald Trump are not the same thing. Now, John Bolton, who I've known for literally decades, is a very smart man whose sole fixation, as far as I understand, is on preserving the sovereignty of the United States. He, in ways that I've never fully understood, regards all kinds of international treaties as constraints, not only constraints on American behavior, but also potential intrusions on the internal workings of the United States. He's a lawyer. By the way, he's not a neocon, please. He's got a very legal mind, and that's the way he looks at these treaties. And so for him, he really does believe in a national sovereignty. Now, from my point of view,
His book, by the way, was called "No Surrender: Defending the United States at the UN."
Great.
I mean, except to support what you're saying.
I mean, to my mind, I've never understood what the fear of America losing. I mean, it's the most powerful country in the world. We were always, at best, a Gulliver tied down by strings, which we could rip through anytime we wanted to. And so anything that we accepted, in a way, was voluntary. I never understood why he was so obsessed by this. Well, right. I mean, I understand the legal argument for it, but what I don't understand is how you could actually be worried that American sovereignty in any meaningful way was under threat. Right. So let's leave John Bolton, because John Bolton, and I love John Bolton, so I don't want to leave him entirely. But I mean, John Bolton is.
I thought we left John Bolton in 2006.
John Bolton.
I thought he would never come back.
He represents a mindset.
John Bolton was one John Bolton in the Reagan administration, and it didn't matter that much. Might argue it did. I don't think it really did. That's not the problem. In my view, John Bolton is not the problem. The problem is what Trump represents. Now, getting into what Donald Trump represents is a very tricky business. But I do think that what he certainly, every president, their foreign policy preferences are shaped by how they won the presidency. So, and they tend to look for like-minded peoples around the world to affiliate with. Bill Clinton looked out and he saw Tony Blair. Ronald Reagan saw Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl. That's a pretty standard thing. But Donald Trump did not run as a representative of either major party. He ran at the head of a populist nationalist movement. And so as he looks out at the world, he sees friends among populist nationalists and enemies among defenders of the liberal consensus on both the right and the left that he feels he defeated in those elections, and who he believes are trying to undermine him at every step, and he's not wrong. So he, therefore, has made his alliances with these groups who are antithetical to the liberal international order. If you want the sort of intellectual version of this, you can read Steve Bannon's comments on it, and I don't want to... Donald Trump is not Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is a quasi-intellectual. Donald Trump is not a quasi-intellectual even. But I do think that there is that affinity. I don't think Donald Trump knows any more than those Brexiteers are like me and I like them. Marine Le Pen likes what I like and she hates what I hate, which is, of course, even more important. And you could go right, Viktor Orban hates what I hate. And so that's the formation. Now, unfortunately, the result of this is that for the first time in American history, and this goes even back to the isolationist period, the American administration actively sides with opponents of the liberal international order. That has never occurred before in our history. That's what makes Trump special. Last question is relative strength of the United States. This may just seem crazy to you. I am not persuaded that the United States has suffered or would suffer inevitable relative decline vis-a-vis other powers. Yes, Asian economic strength is growing. Yes, Chinese economic strength is growing. But I've been listening now for a decade. I've been having this argument with Ed Luce and others about America's share of global GDP, which has actually not dropped very significantly. I think it's gone from 24% to 22%. American share of global GDP has been at this level since 1967, and it doesn't change. American military capacity still dwarfs other countries. China's the obvious threat to sort of supplant the United States, and I don't mean literally supplant it, but I mean to sort of be the competitor. I wouldn't trade our position for China's for anything. They are surrounded by major, well-armed powers who fear them and who look to us for support. You have to fall off a log to blow that strategic situation. We are falling off a log. But there is nothing easy, I won't say easy. China's a historic kind of a challenge. But all we need to do, really, is maintain our relative military strength and those alliances. The smartest Chinese strategic thinkers that I have read, people like Yan Shui-tong and others, they know that America has 50-plus strategic alliances and military relationships with other countries, most of whom have all the wealth in the world, and China has 2, North Korea and Pakistan. They know that is a problem for them. And I think that we don't, so therefore, the thing that let me just end by saying, we managed to create a very strong structure of international relationships of which the United States is at the center. It's going to take a lot to undermine that. We're doing our best, but it would take a lot to undermine that. So I don't actually believe in our relative decline as a matter of sort of material reality. I more fear our unwillingness to continue playing the role, and in that sense, we are in decline.
I'll take Jeffrey here, and John in the front row, and the ambassador.
Thank you, Beatrice. Jeff Laurenti. Bob, I wonder if we could home in on exactly what we mean by a, quote, liberal international order. The set of institutions that are represented by the buildings behind you, developed in 1945, were premised on international law commonly agreed to in a peaceful political process by negotiations in international institutions that players in the system would adhere to, and not necessarily on internal democratic forms, which have been bit by bit expanded, particularly in the 70s in Latin America, 80s elsewhere, 90s clearly in the former Soviet bloc. But it's been not the authoritarian regimes, so-called, that have been challenging these premises of international law, international institutions, but people right in the US. Decade and a half ago, it was Americans who were talking about Europeans being from Venus and Americans from Mars.
Who said that?
It was Americans who were quoting Cicero or Caligula, let them hate us so long as they fear us. And it would, and I have to pose to you, whether really it's been, over the past 20 years, American policies that have been, until 2017, maintaining the garden, or in many ways, inviting in the invasive species. Whether a fixation from Clinton to Bush on overthrowing Saddam Hussein, or whether it was NATO expansion, or whether it was kicking Serbia out of Kosovo, all of these that were taken outside the realm of the international rules of the game. Is that perhaps as much of a threat to the international order as the backsliding on democratic rule that we've been going through in the past decade, and the combination of economic stress and population movements, let's put it that way.
Pass that mic to John Hirsch, if you will.
Yes, indeed.
So, first of all, thank you very, very much.
John, introduce yourself for the
I'm with
camera.
IPI, John Hirsch. You made a strong case, but I wonder whether this is somewhat a fluke, that what's going on in this country. In other words, Hillary Clinton won the majority of the vote, and it was the Electoral College that put her over. So it's really not true that most Americans wanted Trump. So we're living with the consequence of this fluke in the Electoral College. So I wonder if you could comment further. You know, we don't know what's going to happen in the next election, but I'm not so convinced that the forces of authoritarianism are really on the rise in this country. And I'm using this example of Hillary's strange defeat to kind of make my point.
Very good. And who was the third? Oh, yes, indeed. The one genuine ambassador in the room, please.
Well,
And Jürgen, would you introduce yourself just because we have a webcast back there?
thank you very much. I'm Jung Schulz. I'm from the German mission to the United Nations. And first of all, I wanted to thank Robert really very much for his very thought-provoking analysis, and I think it's extremely interesting. I have two questions, basically. First of all, when was the tipping point from your point of view? I think when Francis Fukuyama, 1989, he was pretty right. I mean, you can discuss the conclusions, but of course, the liberal order was doing fine. 10 years later, the liberal order was still doing fine. I would argue even in 2008, it was probably doing fine, although we saw financial crisis, we saw Russian occupation of Georgia and all the rest of it. But I think the system was all right. So when, in your judgment, was the tipping point? And the second question is, looking at the building behind us, the United Nations, a very simple question. It's a very complicated, complex organization. But my question is, are they doing the gardening or are they creating chaos?
I didn't plant that, by the way, to continue the metaphor, but that's perfect.
So those are all terrific questions, and now I can be sure to say something that's not going to be popular in this room in answering Jeff's question, because my definition of the liberal world order does not center around the United Nations. It does not center around international law. It centers around the establishment after World War II of a European and Asian security order, the transformation of the two autocratic aggressor states, Germany and Japan, into Pacific, economically dynamic democracies. To my mind, that is the core of the liberal world order. That is what made possible the expansion of peace and democracy in Europe and in Asia, and of course undergirded by American power. Now, and obviously, the United States, neither at the beginning, nor in the middle, nor at the end, felt itself bound to obey in the very rules that it established in the UN Charter. America acted as if it lived with a double standard, that everybody else had to follow the rules, but the keeper of the order did not always have to follow the rules. Now, we were to some extent constrained, and we felt guilty sometimes when we didn't follow the rules, but we definitely, that's why I never refer to it as the rules-based international order, because for an American to do that would be pure hypocrisy, because America has not followed the rules. Now, we can debate why things have gone the direction that they've gone. I don't believe that Russia and China need the example of the United States or any other power to behave as powers always do. They didn't need to see us in Iraq. They were angry at us long before Iraq. The Russian government had already, the Russian people had already turned. And if you want to, there was a very long discussion that we can have about NATO enlargement. I personally believe that NATO enlargement was not a threat to Russia, that most Russians, that even Russian generals admitted that as NATO enlarged, nevertheless, the American security position was retracting and that Russia actually faced less of a threat from Europe. Gorbachev did not feel he faced a major threat from Europe. And if you look at Russia and its neighborhood, and you would say you've got China on one flank, you've got Central Asia on the other flank, and you've got NATO on this flank, which is your most dangerous flank? It is not NATO. Poland is not invading Russia. So, but we can get into the whole Russian psychology. I think what we really got in the way of with Russia was their sense of their great power status in the world. Unfortunately for the world, their great power status, their definition of great power status includes relative hegemony in Central Europe. That's traditionally been Russia's position. So that we can go back and forth, but I would not, my basic view, and this is the harshest thing I can possibly say, is that these international institutions are like the scaffolding around the building. The building holds up the scaffolding doesn't hold up the building. And at the core of any kind of liberal international order, there has to be power on the side of liberal nations. So I bet you and I can be having this debate till we're both dead. And people will welcome that day. Okay. Now, was this election a fluke? Is an interesting question. The election was a fluke in the sense that we elected this guy. I don't think it was a fluke in other sense. This election, by the way, and this is, I think, important to think about. The things that happened in this election, this is not the first time America has gone through a political cycle like this. The election that this reminds me of more than any election is the election of 1920. If you think about the election of 1920, it was a rejection of internationalism as represented by the League of Nations and Woodrow Wilson. It was the beginning of a major anti-immigration move in the United States. The most draconian anti-immigration legislation in our history was passed in the early 1920s. And this followed 20 years of the most incredible growth in immigration in the United States. So you had anti-internationalism, anti-immigration, and heightened protectionism. And there was just this general desire on the part of Americans to kind of close off. Now, the difference between the 1920 election and this election is the 1920 election elected Warren Harding, who was not a good president and was not a particularly fit president, but he was not Donald Trump. And if we had elected whatever the equivalent of Warren Harding was, we would be unhappy and things would be moving in the wrong direction, but we wouldn't be discussing whether it was a fluke or it wasn't a fluke. We would just say, well, this happens in American politics. The unusual thing that happened was the Republican Party lost control, because parties are supposed to control who their nominee is. They lost control and Trump got it. But the more important question then is, what about the overall trends? Yes, one person could win an election or another person could win an election. I don't think even if Hillary Clinton had won the election, that the trends in American politics and American attitudes would be very different. And I'll tell you what, for me, was the most telling thing, one of the most telling things that happened in the 2016 campaign. When she had to renounce the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a deal that she had helped negotiate, that in some respects was her crowning achievement as Secretary of State. That told us that it didn't matter, Republican, Democrat, Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, whatever, the American public had turned in a fundamental way against free trade. And I think, I don't mean everybody, and I don't mean 100%, but that is certainly a mood. I believe that the American public's attitude toward immigration is not dramatically different from Donald Trump's position. We saw Republicans running away. Marco Rubio, I keep mentioning Marco Rubio, I don't know why. Marco Rubio was part of the Gang of 13, which was trying to come up with a resolution, and he saw long before Donald Trump was even on the horizon that was going to be perilous for him and the Republican Party, and he ran away from it. And that, to me, was that canary in that coal mine. We are in an anti-immigration mood. Is it surprising? No. We've had another long wave of high immigration. Americans have reacted against that. And in foreign policy, and this gets to the tipping point question. If you want to know what I think the tipping point was, it was the day Frank Fukuyama published his article. And I'm not blaming Frank. But what I'm saying is, after the Cold War ended, and if you say what is the tipping point in the world affairs, I have a very America-centric view of world affairs, and so my view is that when the United States shifts direction, that has the ripple effect around the world that we're seeing. Americans changed direction the day after the Cold War ended. And I think if you look at the past 30 years, what you've seen are Americans, we were talking about this before, Americans increasingly asking and demanding answers to the question, could you please remind us why we're out there doing this stuff? Americans are under the mistaken impression, which is reinforced by serious intellectuals and historians for reasons I don't understand, that we created this world order in response to the Soviet Union. We did not. This order was created in response to World War II, at a time when people thought the Soviets were going to be an ally. Nevertheless, Americans believed it was a response to the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union went away and international communism went away, Americans, like Jean Patrick said, now we can go back to being a normal nation. And I think you can see evolving from 1989 on a growing sentiment that this was not something we wanted to be paying for anymore. This was not something we wanted to be sacrificing for. And Iraq was the catalyst that pushed things over the edge. That Americans were so understandably unhappy with what happened in Iraq that they said, that's it. And this is true in both parties, and it doesn't matter who the president is. At the same time that the Republican Party has moved in an anti-immigration, protectionist, and increasingly isolationist direction, so has the Democratic Party. If Joe Biden wins the nomination, we'll have the last vestige. It takes running, how old is he?
79.
76? 7? Whatever. It takes running a 76 or 77-year-old now to find someone who remembers why we ever were involved in the world. Okay? So I wish him well. He's my candidate, etc. Is this off the record? That's like the worst.
It's not. There's a camera back there.
That's like the worst thing. I don't really like Joe Biden. I really think he'd be a disastrous president. So, anyway, so I think that even though the election was a fluke in the way you talk about, I wish I could tell you I thought that the attitudes that have been reflected in this election are a fluke rather than a trend.
I'll take 3 more questions. Okay, back in the back. Here, Lawrence, and young woman there.
Yeah, because we are across the street, I'm wondering if you could put your reflections from the point of view of the importance or lack thereof of human rights in today's world. Not just in America's politics, just the value of human life, immigrant or not.
Where was the next one? Oh, right here, Lawrence. Wait for the microphone here. And Lawrence, introduce yourself to the camera.
Lawrence Moss. So thank you so much. It's an enormously compelling presentation. I want to work with 2 things you said. First, that this was an enormously successful period, the last half century in human history. So much prosperity, so much success for the United States, continuation of holding over 20% of the GDP of the world. And at the same time, that how much more ominous it would be if we had the kind of extreme dislocations we had in the 30s. And that's why we understand why in the 30s there were people that were prepared to embrace fascism, because the world really had come apart economically. Our world does not come apart economically. So understanding the transformation of the Republican Party, so much of it into a proto-fascist cult that would follow the leader and whatever he says, no matter how ignorant, no matter how stupid, no matter how obviously wrong, and follow down any path that he would say, is very shocking and hard to explain, because the success is still here in this country, and how much worse it would be if we actually had the conditions that produced Germany in the 1930s.
And then the young woman right there.
Hi, my name is Juliana. I'm with International Civil Society Committee. So my question is about how America and Western Europe actually viewed around the world. So there is an argument, for example, in Eastern Europe, that people want freedom, people want democracy, and people want equal rights, but they don't want these things being imposed by America. They're very critical because they know what happened during Arab Spring, like the American involvement in Iraqi war and in Syrian war, so they don't trust it. They don't trust Europe either because of the colonialism and how it caused immigration crisis. So in practice, what America and Western world can do actually just to, I think, earn this trust from people and how they can spread liberal world order. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay. All right. Great. More great questions. I mean, look, human rights is the, it is the essence of liberalism, and protection of individual rights is what makes liberalism liberalism, and so human rights are obviously a vital goal. And we're used to shunting human rights off to the side as a nice thing if we can get it, but meanwhile let's focus on our national interests. And one of the things that I'm trying to argue, I'm not the only person who ever made the argument, is that is our interest. I mean, it is our interest, and it was a nice. You could make light of it at a time when there was no real challenge to democracy, and then you could say, well, human rights is a luxury in this place or that place. But I think what we're facing now, and this is the basic thrust of the essay I published in the Washington Post, is a genuine challenge to liberalism everywhere. And one of the things that I talk about, and again, other people have also made this point, and I think it's very important, is that because of the changes of technology, because of social media, artificial intelligence, data collection, all authoritarian regimes are now, in a way, a threat to everyone's freedom. And what I mean by that is we all know what's happening in China. We all know that Chinese technological capability to know what you're reading, who you're talking to, what you're buying, where you're traveling, and also the ability to shape what you read, what you hear, etc., and then the ability finally to punish you or reward you based on what you're saying or not saying, this whole idea of the social credit register, that is the future in authoritarian societies, which for me puts the final nail in the coffin of the distinction that Jean Kirkpatrick wanted to make between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I don't know what could be more totalitarian than this Chinese model. And of course, the Chinese are able and are exporting this technology. And authoritarians don't care whether they're right-wing authoritarians, left-wing authoritarians, friends of the United States, not friends of the United States. They're all going to want this technology. Sisi wants this technology in Egypt. And therefore, even countries that we are, in my view, mistakenly treating as our friends in the battle against whatever Islamic radicalism, they're not our friends. And the world that we're moving into now is going to be a world divided between a government surveillance and control sector and a sector where that is not the case. And the government surveillance and control sector is getting larger and larger every day around the world, and the area where that is not the case is getting smaller and smaller. And not to mention their ability to penetrate into our societies through social media and data collection, etc. So human rights, I never thought human rights was just a nice thing as opposed to a core thing, but now I think the case is stronger than ever that where liberalism vanishes, this threat emerges, and it's a threat directly to us. The question of why we have this reaction in the United States, even though the economic situation is not that bad, I just feel like we've overestimated the economic factor in what this vote has been all about and what this unhappiness is all about. When I hear that people in Appalachia or in the Pennsylvania steel industry are doing poorly in their economy, they've been doing poorly in their economy for 30 or 40 years, I mean, that's not what's new. I think what we're seeing really, I put this political movement much more on cultural, ethnic, racial issues rather than on economic issues. And that is certainly true in Europe, where the polling shows that most of the people who fuel populist nationalist movements are not doing poorly economically. They're upset about the assault on their culture. And so, and that is, of course, a harder problem to solve, because if you could just say, well, people are having, not that we know how to solve everybody's economic problem, God knows, but if it was just an economic problem, you could say, okay, we have to figure out a way to solve their economic problem. But how do you solve their cultural problem? Are we going to roll back the rights that are offending them? Are we going to roll back gay marriage, which had a huge impact on people's perception, on many people's perception, that this country was moving in a way that they didn't recognize? Let's not lose sight of the fact that gay marriage and other gay rights issues have had a huge impact on politics, not to mention resentment about races and ethnic and foreign ethnic groups that are making their way up through society protected by rights, and people feel like they're losing control of their world. Okay, this is as old as America itself. By the way, the white male Anglo-Saxon Protestant has felt under siege since 1819. This is not a new phenomenon, and we've dealt with it in many different ways, including a civil war. Which, in a way, leads me to the question about Eastern and Central Europe. Now, the first thing to be said about Eastern and Central Europe is that no one actually told them that they had to join the West. It was their fondest desire, their most passionate desire, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the fall of the Soviet Union, to join the West. And by the way, when we talk about NATO enlargement, Jeff, the impetus for NATO enlargement was not for the United States. The United States didn't run around to Poland and Hungary and others saying, gee, would you like to join NATO? They came essentially begging at the door to be brought into the security environment to protect them against Russia, but also to join the economic order, the liberal economic order, and the terms of that included their democratization. So in a way, for them to now say, why did you impose this stuff on us, I feel has the story a little bit backwards. However, and they have now the option, it seems to me, of leaving the West if they would like to. I wish we were saying to countries like Hungary, you don't want to be an actual liberal government? That's fine. You can also leave NATO and the EU while you're at it. The wonderful thing that they get to do is they get to be in NATO, they get to be in EU, and they get to be aggressively illiberal. And I just can't tell. Obviously, you could go through American foreign policy at any period, all the way through the Cold War, from the beginning to the end and after, and say, you did Iraq, and you did Syria, and you did Vietnam, and you overthrew Allende, and everybody has always found many things that America did wrong because America did many things wrong. But at the end of the day, countries either decide that they want to be part of this or they don't want to be part of this. And it really isn't about America at the end of the day. And I do think that some leaders in Eastern and Central Europe are playing on whole ranges of dissatisfaction in order to make themselves effectively authoritarian leaders. There's no question in my mind that that's what Viktor Orban has done. There's no question in my mind that that's what the Polish Law and Justice Party are doing, that that's what is happening in Italy. There are always dissatisfactions and people are playing on them. And I'm happy to blame the United States and the West for any number of things, but I just don't think that that is the phenomenon that we're actually dealing with.
We got time for 3 more questions. David here, and maybe David, you'll be the last question.
Fascinating topic. And
Tell the camera who you are.
David Gottlieb. One of the most interesting things is what you've talked about in the past. Now become a prophet and tell me about what you think is going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years in our world, not just America.
Well, thank you. Well, I will tell you what I'm worried about. Is that okay? Is that enough of a stand-in? Because, you know, as a historian, you know perfectly well that there are trends in history, and then there are events. And the events sometimes are the product of those trends, but sometimes they send trends in a different direction. So I don't believe in saying this is what's going to happen. What I can say is this is the trend. And when it has its effect, who knows? For instance, just to take an example, I think it's now clear that all the things that went wrong in the 1930s were the result of policies undertaken in the 1920s. I don't, you know, by the time Roosevelt is elected, the world is already completely out of control. We spend most of our time saying, well, gee, how could you have been in isolation in the 1930s? But in a way, the die had already been cast by policies at a time when the world seemed like it was in great shape. So I'm still talking about history. I will get to your point. But if we'd been sitting here in 1925, we would have seen a fairly successful democracy in Germany, a fairly successful democracy in Japan, a booming American economy, the agreement between France and Germany at Locarno. We'd be 3 years away from Kellogg-Briand declaring the outlawing war as we know it. That's 1925. Now just go 10 years later and look at what 1935 looks like. And that's why I say things go much faster than you think they do. I have a line about world order, which is like that. There's this great Hemingway line in The Sun Also Rises. Someone who went bankrupt is asked, how did you go bankrupt? And he says, gradually and then suddenly. And I think, unfortunately, that's kind of the way world orders collapse, gradually and then suddenly. So with that as a preface, I'm very worried about the trends in Europe. It seems to me that as Europe renationalizes, all the elements that have kept this European miracle going are all under threat right now. And I think of four in particular. And I have an essay coming out about Germany and the return of the German question, which does not make Germans happy, and I don't, but this is actually, my view of Germans is very positive, but I worry about a scenario in which they're going to be living in a Europe that puts them in a very, very difficult position. I think they're already there. But if you think about four things that put this order together. One, the American security guarantee, which made it possible for Europeans to trust each other enough to get rich together. Two was the suppression of nationalism, first through the European Steel and Coal Community, through the EC, up to the EU. Third was the spread of democracy, which gave Europeans a sense of common culture. And fourth was an international free trade regime, which allowed Germany in particular to become the export giant that it became, but which also made it possible for all of Europe to prosper in a global exporting free trade environment. Every single one of those key planks is now at risk, mostly because of the United States, partly because of what's happening in Europe. Nationalism returning, democracy is backsliding, the American security guarantee is now in question, and America is undermining the global free trade regime and targeting Germany in particular, by the way. So to me, what does it mean for Europe to unravel? And I think we have a lot of these sort of, well, Europe is failing, Europe is this and that, but it's kind of like, what does that all mean? Well, to me, it means that Europe returns to the problems that it had in the past. Now, they'll deal with them differently because history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but the problems return. And if the United States has absented itself and the British are floating out to the Arctic Ocean, it's going to be left to Europe again. And I just think that is a real potential disaster, which no one is focusing on. Now, on the Asia front, obviously everything depends on what we do. But there is this perception that I keep coming across that somehow, well, China's just going to become the hegemon of Asia. So the United States is basically going to be retracting. That's what history would suggest, economics, etc. And so China will just become the hegemon. And it's in a very way, it's in a kind of comforting, it's a nice smooth transition. It is not going to be a smooth transition. Japan is not going to go quietly into this good night. As soon as they perceive that the United States is out of the game in any fundamental way, and China is going to be doing what any country in China's position would be doing, Japan is going to renationalize, rearm, go nuclear, and we are going to be back to the Asian set of conflicts. By the way, so is Korea, so is India, which is already nuclear, etc. You have, Aaron Friedberg, a friend of mine, once referred to Asia's future as Europe's past, and that is where we're heading. And so that is a recipe for conflict, not for nice, gradual Chinese hegemony. And what does the United States do in that situation? That's where we are on that front. I could go around the world, but isn't that enough? You know, is that enough?
It is. Before I call this, I want to tell you there are books for sale outside. I'm going to keep Bob here with his signing pen. I might even bring you a glass of wine if you want one. Anyway, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really want to thank you, Bob, for coming here.
Thank you.
Just great.